We are going to be missing 3 of the best tight ends in fantasy football to bye weeks this week. Who are some of the names that we can count on to replace them? We're talking about our top 15 tight end rankings right now. Now, typically before we get into the rankings, I go over my bigger hits and misses from just last week, but we got to be completely honest. Almost every tight end in football sucked last week. We all got spoiled by the one weekend of National Tight End Days where we had like 16 fantasy viable tight ends, and now, all of a sudden, we're back to our 4 a week or so that actually put up some fantasy points. So let's go ahead and just flush week 9 and dive right into week 10, starting off in tier 1. And right here in tier 1, we got George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Cade Otton, and Trey McBride. Now for George Kittle, he's going up against Tampa Bay. He's the current tight end 1 overall on the year, coming off of his bye week, and he hasn't had less than 10 fantasy points in a game since week 1. Now a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. With all that being said, give me a little George Kittle at number 1. Number 2, it's Travis Kelce going up against Denver, and the usage has gone through the roof for Travis Kelce with all the injuries in Kansas City. He's had 10 plus targets now in 3 of his last 4 games played, just had his first 100-yard game of the season last week, and now with DeAndre Hopkins about to be a little bit more involved and Juju getting close to a return, are we going to start seeing that usage decline? That's entirely possible, but I don't think it happens in week 10 going up against Denver. They only allow 7 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but with the target share, I left him at number 2. Number 3, it's Cade Otton going up against San Francisco. The best thing about the injuries in Tampa Bay is that we have gotten to see that Cade Otton is arguably one of the best young tight ends overall in the NFL. Right now, he's up to tight end 4 on the season, has 31 targets, 25 catches, 258 yards, and 3 touchdowns over his last 3 games. Now a matchup going up against San Francisco, who allows 8 fantasy points per game, but this one right here is all about the volume and the play of Baker Mayfield. I got Cade Otton at number 3. After him at number 4, we got Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Jets, and McBride continues to be the most consistent pass catcher in this Arizona offense. He's the current tight end 4 overall in the season, one of only 3 tight ends in the NFL to average over 10 fantasy points per game, but this is not some easy matchup going up against the Jets. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so Trey McBride right here at the bottom of tier 1. Now after tier 1, we go down to tier 2 where I got Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram, Dalton Kincaid, Taysom Hill, and TJ Hawkinson. Now for Kyle Pitts, he's going up against New Orleans, and we saw the string of good games for Kyle Pitts come to an end in week 9. Only 1 catch for 11 yards, absolutely sucked. Now we know Drake London is banged up and dealing with a hip injury, but the Saints allow over 8 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so I got Kyle Pitts at number 5. At 6, this is where I got Evan Ingram of the Jacksonville Jaguars going up against Minnesota. Really an odd situation here as of late with Evan Ingram. 20 targets over his last 3 games, but only 14 catches for 116 yards over that span. It's a lot of dink and dunk receptions. You have to think that that volume remains though, with all the injuries that Jacksonville is currently working through. So for that reason, in a matchup against Minnesota, who is easier to throw on than run on, I got Evan Ingram at number 6. Now at 7's where I got Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills going up against Indianapolis, and we'd just love to say that he is some weekly safe low-end tight end 1, but we can't. I mean, he has the volume to be that. He's averaging over 7 targets a game over his last 6 games. We know that Amari Cooper and Keon Coleman are both questionable to play as well. In a matchup going up against Indianapolis, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, things are lining up for Dalton Kincaid to have a pretty decent week. Now after him, I put Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints, and this one may be a little bit spicy. But with everyone in New Orleans hurt, you have to think that Taysom Hill continues to have a larger role than normal. He just had 5 carries and 5 targets in week 9. He could easily see more than that in week 10. Now in a matchup going up against Atlanta, they allow over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but we know that Taysom Hill isn't the quote-unquote normal tight end. But with the added rushing work that he could see this week, it's why I had to put him inside the top 10 at number 8. And number 9, I went TJ Hawkinson going against Jacksonville. He actually looked pretty good last week, and he only played 45% of the snaps, had 4 targets, 3 catches, and 27 yards. Also had a couple plays that were called back due to penalty. His day could have been even better, and we have to think that he gets more and more work each and every week. We saw Josh Oliver get 5 targets last week. Some of that volume probably going to start migrating the way of TJ Hawkinson. And now in a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so Hawk right here at the bottom of tier 2. Now after tier 2, we got tier 3. It's Jake Ferguson, Mike Gesicki, Mark Andrews, Sam Laporta, Theo Johnson, and Hunter Henry. For Jake Ferguson, he's got a matchup going up against Philadelphia. And when we think about him this season, it's somewhat of an overall disappointment. But do you realize that he's averaging more targets, more receptions, and more yards per game than he did just last year? The big difference is he's just not scoring touchdowns. Now we have an injury to Dak Prescott. So does that mean that Jake Ferguson turns into a little bit more of a safety blanket in this offense? Because we also know that CeeDee Lamb is not 100% healthy either. Now this matchup isn't ideal going against Philadelphia. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but with the usage that Jake Ferguson could see, he's a low-end tight end 1 right now at number 10 overall. Then we got Mike Gesicki going up against Baltimore, and the rookie tight end Eric All is out for the year with a torn ACL in Cincinnati. Now we also know that T. Higgins is doubtful to play on a short week since they're playing on Thursday Night Football. Mike Gesicki has been a big-time producer when he sees at least 6 targets a game. Now a matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows over 10 fantasy points per game, and we're missing T. Higgins. We're in line for another good Mike Gesicki week. That's why he's inside the top 12. Then we got Mark Andrews going up against Cincinnati, his opponent in that game. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not convinced that Mark Andrews continues to see safe volume with Deontay Johnson being more and more integrated into this offense. It really makes Mark Andrews a touchdown-reliant option. Now, it does help that Isaiah likely will not play in this ballgame, and that's why Mark Andrews is still up inside the top 12, because Cincinnati does allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. Now, after Andrews, we got Sam Laporta going up against Houston, and I had really hoped we would see more from Sam Laporta with Jameson Williams being out, but we really didn't, and mostly, that's because the Lions are always up by so many points, they're not having to throw the ball a ton. But now J-Mo returns, and no team allows less fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends than the Houston Texans. This is not ideal this week. Then we go down to Theo Johnson against Carolina. He was 2nd on the team in targets just last week. He's averaging almost 12 yards per reception on the year, and he is a 6'6" big-time red zone threat. But what I've really been paying attention to is his involvement in this offense. He's been on the field at least 85% of the time over the last month. Now, between that and the matchup going up against Carolina, no team allows more fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends than the Carolina Panthers. I had to include Theo Johnson. And then we rounded out with Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots going against Chicago. A much better chance at a good game when Drake May is playing quarterback for Hunter Henry. This ceiling, it just isn't going to be there. It's going to remain low just due to the lack of touchdown upside. Now, in a matchup going up against Chicago, they allow 9 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and I would be absolutely pumped if I started Hunter Henry this week and he got me 9 fantasy points. So there you have the top 15 tight ends for week 10. Now, it absolutely sucks that we don't have David Njoku and Brock Bowers and Tucker Kraft, but there are some other options out there that can get us by this week. Now, if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor by hitting the like button if you haven't already, and then consider subscribing to the channel. I don't care that it's already week 10. If you're looking for a fantasy football home, join Headliner Nation. Now I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, all the chain, all the channels, not the same.